I'd like to begin by first kind of discussing and addressing the perceptions and stereotypes in sport. I know so often in men's athletics, if you're playing football or basketball, the assumption is you are straight. Then if you're a woman, or if you're a man in diving or gymnastics, the assumption is often that you might be gay. Professor Buzuvis, can you discuss kind of how these assumptions and these stereotypes of gender expectations drive homophobia in sports, and then how this culture, often it's the culture of masculinity that leads to it, and how that conduct, things like don't play like a girl or using a lavender jersey, and how those are bad things to have in sport?
Sure. If I could just start my answer though by thanking you, Pete and Sela, for organizing this program on a very important topic. I know Brian and I are both very grateful and excited to be here and participating in that. As to your question, I promise I won't make this a total history lesson and walk down memory lane, but if I could just start with a little historical context. Many sport opportunities were intentionally developed as a way to promote masculinity. The origin of many collegiate and scholastic sports, as well as recreational sports like Little League, coincided with, of all things, the Industrial Revolution. What was happening to families in the Industrial Revolution? For the first time, fathers were working outside of the home. And they were working more frequently in jobs that didn't require them to constantly be demonstrating certain traditional masculine values like strength and stoicism and aggressiveness and all these things. So as a culture, we became very anxious about this and what effect this was going to have on young men in our culture who were left at home to be raised by their mothers and would go to school to be influenced by their largely female teachers. So a concerted effort was made to channel boys into activities where their masculinity could be cultivated, and sports was part of that project. And the way that it worked was that sports was deliberately designed to enhance not just masculinity generally, or multiple masculinities, but the particular version of masculinity that is most diametrically opposed to that which is feminine. Sociologists call this the hegemonic masculinity. It's the kind of masculinity that you think about when you think about the quintessential stereotypical man. Somebody who's strong, somebody who's stoic, somebody who's aggressive and competitive, and someone who's straight. Because all of those things are as far away as you can get from being feminine. And so sport throughout the years, it started with this intentional purpose and hasn't entirely gotten away from that role that it plays in society. It's still a proving ground for masculinity, and it does it by emphasizing and showcasing and valorizing this hegemonic masculinity. Within the context of contemporary sports, you can still see evidence of this in the language that's used in practice, in the locker rooms, any association of male athletes with that which is feminine or more like feminine is a successful insult, is a successful motivator. If everybody in that locker room is striving to be as masculine as possible, you're only as masculine as your last demonstration of masculinity. You're only as straight as your last straight act. So it's a status that you have to constantly replicate over and over again by putting down others who are not engendering hegemonic masculinity. And there's just a lot of pressure always to conform to this. And coaches can exploit that pressure, equating their athletes with with women or with gay men as a way to motivate them, for example. And I think that's the origin of things like, both verbal insults, like you play like a girl or you play like a sissy, as a way to try to get athletes to strive harder. Or symbolic gestures of the same kind. And so when a coach puts out a lavender jersey for their weakest player to wear, that coach doesn't have the luxury of doing that without all of this cultural baggage that comes with him into that decision. We live in a world where sport has had this historic role and still practices that still serves as a proving ground for masculinity. We also live in a world where symbols have meaning and colors have strong symbolic associations. So I would say that a coach, even a well-intentioned coach, doesn't have the luxury of being able to not think about that when they're putting together a kind of practice routine that's going to, incorporate some kind of motivation technique when it touches on this gender nerve, such as by using a stereotypical, gay color like lavender, as opposed to, any other color, even closely related to lavender, like purple, which would have not been problematic or not be seen in that way. Another example of the same sort is one that I'm more intimately familiar with. You mentioned in my biography that I spent a couple semesters as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa. And while I was there, the University of Iowa Athletic Department decided to renovate its stadium, Kinnick Stadium. I know you play Iowa, so feel free to hiss and boo at the mention of all things Hawkeye. So they decided to deck out the visitors' locker room as a tribute to a former coach who had in his day painted the walls pink. So the walls of the visitor locker room were painted pink historically, and during the renovation, that pinkness was taken to a whole new level. We had pink lockers, pink urinals. Where do you get a pink urinal? Well, Europe, apparently. They had to import pink urinals from Europe. Everything in this locker room is pink. Somebody said it looked like, Barbie's dream house on acid. Somebody said, you feel naked if you walk in there without a handbag in one hand and a chihuahua in the other. Okay, so there's clearly some gendered symbolism that goes into creating a room for your opponents to use that's entirely pink. Due to some circumstances that are too boring to get into, I had the opportunity to weigh in on this question of gender equality or gender equity at the University of Iowa, and I said that they were kind of missing an opportunity to examine the gendered implications of this pink locker room. And I was sort of immediately targeted by a lot of resistance and pushback for making what I thought was a pretty obvious observation about what seemed to be going on. And I think that what that experience taught me was how resistant sport is to change. That one of the most important things about athletics, and particularly about football, because face it, there is a hierarchy of masculinity when it comes to men's sport, and football's at the top, and so there's much more at stake for football to continue to resist any encroachment by people who would insist on more politically correct ways of using symbols. So that experience, like I was saying, taught me a lot about how deeply entrenched these gender ideas are in college sports and in men's college sports. And the sad thing about it is that when an uproar like that happens, it silences everybody's voice to be able to point out things in sports that are that might be inconsistent with the goal of promoting a particular hegemonic masculinity, and that's something that everybody suffers under. That kind of straitjacket doesn't just affect the closeted gay athletes who may or may not have been playing on Iowa's football team. I don't know if there were any, gay athletes who were offended by that, but I do know that the world becomes oppressive for straight athletes too, when they can't. When they have to constantly adhere to this very limited, narrow version of masculinity, and that the penalty for challenging that is the kind of uproar that I faced after challenging the pink locker room.